Well, the narrative has officially shifted. Transitory inflation is over, and perpetual inflation is the new hotness. Now, again, I don't know how I feel about this. I knew at the time when they first started talking about transitory inflation, they were talking out of their ass. And by they, I mean the financial elite. Powell, the Wall Street types. Nobody knew that inflation was going to be transitory, because inflation is only transitory to the extent that the inflationary policy is transitory. So long as you have the monetary authority, which is kind of split between the federal government and the Fed. It's not that the Fed has 100% control over the money supply, and of course you have commercial banks in there too, but they're not doing a whole lot to inflate the real economy. To the extent that inflationary policy is continued, inflation is going to continue. So you could say, yeah, it's transitory, because if the federal government decided to stop pumping free money into the economy and stop running, massive multi-trillion-dollar deficits every year, and stop passing these multi-trillion-dollar stimulus bills every few months, well, then sure, inflation could be transitory. But as it turns out, none of that has stopped. The Fed has not, raised interest rates. The federal government is not slowing their rate of deficit spending. And remember, the Fed is monetizing $80 billion in federal debt every month. And so that's $960 billion a year, nearly $1 trillion just in QE. And so, that at the very least, you can point to that and say, yeah, that is totally directly inflating the money supply. We are at the very least adding $960 billion, $1 trillion, to the actual money supply in circulation, not just in the financial economy, in the real economy. Because government spending, they write those checks to people. Okay, whether it's defense contractors, whether it's government employees, whether it's stimulus checks, whether it's food stamps, whether it's Medicare or Social Security, that all the money the government spends goes right back out into the real economy. And so the Fed is monetizing $1 trillion of that per year at the current rate. Now, yes, QE is supposedly going to be tapered over the next year at a rate of about 5 to 10 billion a month, which means that as soon as next November, there might be zero in QE. But then, of course, by holding interest rates at 0%, they are increasing the money supply, because without the Fed holding rates there, without the Fed targeting interest rates, I would argue, now there are some people who don't argue this, who say no, we're actually quite close to the natural rate of interest. I argue that the natural rate of interest, meaning the rate of interest that would be determined by a pure market for loanable funds, is much higher than 0%. So the Fed, in order to keep interest rates at 0%, has to inject money into the credit markets. Now, how much are they printing and injecting in there? How much are they increasing the money supply by holding interest rates at zero? We don't know, because it varies. Sometimes it'll take more money, sometimes it'll take less money. Now, here's another conundrum. In the rate of interest, in most, understandings of economics, we're taught that there is a built-in interest rate premium, meaning that whatever the nominal interest rate is, you have to subtract the rate of inflation to get the real interest rate, which means that as of right now, since we have close to 5.5% inflation, even on the CPI, which is, of course, tremendously understated, we have, at the very least, using official government numbers, a real interest rates of negative 5.5%. And as we know from Europe's experience, negative interest rates are not healthy for the economy. You don't have prosperity with negative interest rates. Interest rates and growth. The rate of interest is a very important aggregate price. It aggregates time preference. It aggregates, the rate of growth of the overall economy. Because if you think about it, general interest rates well, I won't get into. I don't want to get too deep into it, but basically, the rate of the higher growth rate an economy has, it's kind of a chicken or an egg question. The higher we would expect the rate of interest, the prevailing rate of interest to be. So, if we had an economy that was growing at 15% a year, some ridiculous, emerging market economy that had super high growth, double digits, you would expect, it wouldn't be ridiculous for there to be double-digit interest rates. And so likewise, when interest rates are very, very, very low, that tends to be associated, and again, chicken or the egg question I don't want to get into right now. Is it the low interest rates that causing the low growth, or does low growth cause low interest rates? That's a very interesting question, but that's not what I want to get into today. When you have very, very low interest rates, let's say even negative rates, you would expect to see a rate of growth in the same neighborhood. So if we have negative 5.5% real interest rates, it wouldn't be shocking for us to have negative real economic growth, meaning that after you subtract out the inflation, GDP in real terms, which I'm not a fan of the GDP number, but again, let's use it because these are official government numbers, it wouldn't be shocking for real GDP to be negative as well. And if that's the case, if we are not about to, if we're not on the cusp of a major, economic boom, if we are in fact on the cusp of a recession, would you expect the government to, this government, to engage in more deficit spending or less deficit spending? Obviously, even if the Republicans were in charge, and frankly, when Trump was in charge, I expected him, to spend a lot and to launch massive stimulus projects in the wake of the whole Wu flu crisis, because I thought that's Keynesianism is just unfortunately that prevalent in the modern West. But certainly with Joe Biden in office, you would expect all that and more. And so if anything, I would expect there to be more deficit spending. And so considering that is, the major source, that's the big change that we've seen, which is, in my opinion, contributing to this high rate of inflation, because we had in official terms, we had a relatively low rate of inflation for a long time. Now, there are plenty of ways to challenge the official rate of inflation, but again, we're taking it for granted for the sake of this video, for this exercise, because now even in official terms, inflation is quite high. So we have to look back on the last year and say, what's changed? What's different? Well, you have a lot less people working, and you have the government spending a whole lot more and taking in, less tax revenue. And so if you want to look at, sort of an aggregation of supply and demand in the U.S. economy, where, demand is money and supply is production, we are seeing less production, meaning a shift to the downside for the supply curve. And we're seeing a lot more money being pumped into the economy, meaning an upward or a sideways shift in the other direction on the demand curve. We're seeing more demand and less supply. And so what does that lead to? That leads to higher prices. That's economics 101, day one in class. That should be obvious. And so if that is the correct explanation, if that's why we're seeing higher prices, then you wouldn't expect prices to stop increasing until production catches back up, or the money supply stops growing at such a rapid pace. Because if we, continue on this trajectory, if, supply chains continue to seize up, if people continue to, keep quitting their jobs, if we don't see labor force participation ticking up and recovering, which again is something I'm very worried about, I don't think is going to happen, well then, the result will be prices will continue to rise, and as the economy weakens, the government will feel empowered to do even more stimulus. Again, shifting that demand curve in the wrong direction, driving up prices ever more. But getting back to what I started this video with, how the zeitgeist has shifted to now saying that inflation is not transitory, when I hear all of the wrong people starting to admit that, I don't know whether to do a victory lap. Although I shouldn't say that. I gave up a while ago making predictions. I said I don't know if inflation is going to take off because we've had so much, there's been so much unprecedented action in recent months. I don't know how it was all going to balance out. But, I didn't do what all of these people were saying, people like Powell and Yellen and all of the, and the actual, private Wall Street elites. I did not go out in public and say, oh, no, inflation's definitely transitory. It's not going to last. Inflation's not, no, there's not going to be any inflation. And since they were so wrong about that, about the transitory nature of this inflation, I'm skeptical to be. I don't want to necessarily be on their same side now, because I feel like these people seem to get a lot wrong, but maybe it's a broken clock right twice a day kind of thing. Now that you have a lot of folks in the mainstream coming around to the "it's not so transitory" narrative, that doesn't necessarily undermine the logic of my argument that I've outlined here today, because I think it's fairly simple. Inflation is not going to go away on its own. The root cause of inflation must end. It has to go away, and that's not happening. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.